Welcome back to the Amazon clone. In this video, we'll focus on using the React testing library to do some testing for our login form. Now, in the previous video, at the very end of it, we set up our Redux Toolkit store, and there was just one little error with that. So if we just take a look at the front end here, and we just sign in, and we just enter the password here, we can see that we're not getting the name that we want to display there. And the reason for that is we didn't actually set the state. So let's just go ahead and work on that for a few minutes, and then we'll get into doing the testing. So in the front end project, in the source code, we can have a look in the features here, and we can have a look at the auth service. And if we take a look at this login method here, we'll see we got this promise of the any type coming back. So what we want to do is we actually want to, rather than just returning the JSON web token itself, we also want to set the user here. And we already are decoding the token, so you may as well just set it here. So rather than having this any type, we'll just go ahead and we'll give back a display user. So recall that the display user type, we'll just F12 into that. Actually, it's given an error at the moment. So let's say display user or null. And actually, I think we just need to import this. Actually, I've created this object here. So let's say the user is going to be the display user or null. So now we can just go into here and we can see the display user is going to be the ID, name, and email. And in addition to that, we'll get the JSON web token, and we've defined that type as the JWT here. We can go ahead and we can save that. And now we can see that rather than getting the promise of the any type back, we're going to get an object with both the JWT and the user, which is the display user or null. So basically what we want to do is, rather than just returning the response data here, if the response data is set, i.e. the login API call worked, we can just go ahead and we can give the JSON web token back, which is what we were giving back, which is the response data. But we can also get the user back here. And on the decoded JSON web token, there's the user object. So we can go ahead and we can get the user object like that. And then if the login fail API call fails, I'm just going to set the user here to null. So I can go ahead and we can save that. Oh, so we've imported that twice. So we can go ahead and we can save that. And then that means we can come to our auth slice. And now we get this error here. So if the login case, if it's fulfilled, what we want to show is it's no longer loading. It's succeeded. And then we want to set our global state for the JSON web token to the action payload.jwt, because it's nested in that object there with the JWT property. And then we can also set the user object. So we got is authenticated to true, but in addition to that, we have the user object, and that's coming from the payload. And so the payload is just the return from here, and then we can just get the user object from there. And that way we can actually just go ahead and we can just set our user. Because what was happening is we were logging in, and that would, it wouldn't set the user. But if we refresh the page, we was getting it from local storage. So this way, when we log in, it just automatically sets the user. And I suppose in the rejected case, we could also say the state of the user. And we can just set that to null. We don't need to get that from the payload. So if it's rejected, it's no longer loading. There is an error. The user will set to null. Is authenticated will be false. And the state of the user will be back to null. And just taking a look at the verification, that all looks well and good. So with that, we can open up our home page here. So in pages, we have this home page here, and we're just logging things out just to see the state of things. One thing to note is we're using this global hook for the use app selector. And if we wanted to say, for example, just get the selected user, that takes the root state and then gives back the auth state. So that's essentially what we've got here. So we could improve on that and just go and get it from the slice and save that. And now if we take a look at the home page, let's just refresh things here. Well, we see that we've got that user state propagating nicely. So let's just verify that. Let's sign out and we'll sign back in. And we can see that's displaying there nicely. Okay, so that's the fix for the previous video. So now we've got all of our Redux Toolkit architecture set up. What I want to focus on in this video is, because we did just get an error, I think error handling, testing is an important thing. So what we'll do is, let's just log out for a second. Let's just test. We'll do unit testing using the React library, testing library. And we'll just make sure that the email is the right type and the password's the right type. And we'll also go ahead and we'll disable this button here, for example, and make it so you can only click on it if you put in valid email and password, and then we'll just test for all of that. So let's go ahead and start to work on some of those things. So let's just go back to the code. The first thing I'm going to do is I'll test for the email stuff. So let me just collapse this front end project and open it back up again. In the shared, in the utils, in the validation, recall that we had this regular expression here. And, this is actually built on common code of the RFC 2822 spec. But we should really be testing for this. I mean, it's not coming from a library where you would assume to be tested. I mean, it's obviously stood the, sands of time. But we also want to validate the length functionality here. And I think we'll be able to illustrate how to do testing. So I'm just going to create a file here, and I'm just going to call it the email. And when we're testing, and specifically what we're doing is we're doing unit testing. So we're not testing the whole end-to-end side of things. We're specifically testing just the email validation function or the length function or the page itself. We will do another video on the integration end-to-end testing. So let's just go ahead and start by defining our test. And you do that by just adding the test suffix there. And I'm making this a TS file rather than a TSX file, because really all I want to be testing for is against this function. So what I'll do here, the first thing I'll do is I'll just go ahead and I'll import the validate email function. And that's just coming in from the same directory. So we can just pull that in like that. And then when it comes to testing, you can have what's known as a testing suite. And that is like the group that you name all of your tests. So you do this by having a describe method here. And then in the first argument, you name what the testing suite is. So we say email validation. And then as the second argument, we have this callback function. And this is where we actually write our individual tests, because we're going to test for multiple things, but it's all related to this email validation stuff. So what we can do is we can just type in test here, and this is a function, and it takes the same sort of approach that this does here. So I'll just go ahead and copy that shape of the signature there, and then just tack on an extra curly bracket and a curved bracket. And what I want to test for, the first thing I want to do is I just want to test that, let's say we have a variable here for email and it's not set. So that's like the default email state in our application. What we can do is we can say we want to test that an empty input should not be valid. Let's get rid of that space there. And then we can have an assertion, and we can just say what we expect to happen is we expect our validate email function, when we take the empty email, and recall that this function is returning a Boolean, so true or false value based on the email. If it matches this regular expression, it's a valid email and it will return true. But if it doesn't, then it'll return false. And if we're just passing in that, we expect that to be false. So we can just tack on this to equal, and then we can specify the value that we want it to take on. I'm just going to open up this terminal here, and I'm running my server and my front end. So I'm just going to go into the front end project, and I'm just going to run an npm test. And this will call the create React app scripts, in particular for the create React testing library. And we can see that we've actually got this passing here. So we've got the test suite name, which is, email validation. And then this particular test that we're running is if it should not be valid. And you can actually nest multiple suites within another. So you could have another describe here if you wanted to. And we'll see an example of that shortly. But essentially testing is pretty straightforward, really. Basically, it's just writing regular JavaScript code. You have these like two methods in particular. So you can describe the test suite, and then you can have the individual tests. And then you have your assertion, and these just sort of reads. So even if you don't really know the language, you can, the testing suite, you sort of just pick it up intuitively. Plus you can also get some intelligence here. So let's say you wanted something else. You could have like to be close to or to be defined and all these other things here. So you really just need to look at the documentation or just sort of know what you want to be testing for ahead of time and be doing that. So that's our first test. And just to make sure that it is working, let's set this to true. And what we would expect, we can see that our test runner is just continuously watching there, and then it goes ahead and it fails. And then it shows you where about it fails. It says what the test is. So we're in the test suite email validation, and then we've got this X here. And that test did not pass. And you can imagine if you're working on a big project, to not have any, side effects elsewhere in your application. Testing is really, really good, particularly if you're in teams on large applications. And it just it sort of helps you to write cleaner code. So yeah, it's good practice, and it gives you the comfort of reducing the errors that make it into production. If you work on one feature and it doesn't have a knock-on effect to another feature, basically, and that becomes more and more important as your application grows. So it's really an investment in the future. But let's just go ahead and just change this back to false. So let's just go ahead and just copy this down, and we could just think of like what other things we would want to do for our email. So we would want it to have, for example, it should have an @ symbol in it. So what we can do here is we can reset our variable, and let's just actually choose a real email address or something that simulates a real email address. So what we could do here is what we're expecting in this scenario is we're expecting that the email, it includes an @ symbol, and then we would expect this to equal true. Okay, so we've got our 2 tests passing. And what else do we have here? Well, we'd also expect it to have a dot in there for the @domain.com. So we can just go ahead and have that. And then we should also not only test things that fail or test things that pass, but also test the passing case for our validation. So we could just say a valid email should pass validation, for example. So based on that previous variable here, we want that to pass. So we can validate this email now, and actually we can copy this whole line here. And we'd expect that that email will pass. We'll just save that, and that passes there. So let's just write one more test here, and you can have as many tests as you want. This helps you test all of the edge cases. So it's really up to you. So what we'll say here is an invalid email should not pass validation. So you can see this pattern we got here. We just got the test we're making, the description of the test that we're defining, the assertion or the expectation that's either, going to be true or false, or, a certain value or something like that. And then we're just writing JavaScript and basing that off the variables. But what I'll do is I'll just copy this email here that I'm expecting to fail. And let's just get rid of the .com. So it's sort of half an email. It has an @ there. But this should be false. So let's just go ahead and save that. And we can see that this test suite works. So pretty straightforward. Now I'm just going to move on to doing the length test suite. So this is going to be a similar thing, but it's just going to demonstrate a couple more, just nesting testing suites, just so that's clear. So I'm just going to have here the length.test.ts file here. And I'm just going to go ahead and copy this in. And I'm just going to delete a few. And let's just get rid of that. We'll just keep one there, like this. So this time what we're doing is we want to test 2 things, but we're both testing the length. So the overall test suite is going to be the field length validation, but we want to test that the name length and the password length both pass validation. So the name length is just making sure you have at least 2 characters, and then the password length is testing between 6 and 20 characters. So let's just go ahead and bring those in. So I'll bring that in, and that's just coming from the length here. And I can get the password length, the name as well. Here's the password length. Let's just close that up and close that up, and then we'll just be worried about our test files here. So, okay, so let's just say we're going to have 2 different test suites here. And I'm just going to copy this in here. And I'm going to change this to name. And I'm actually going to nest this in the first test suite here. So our overall test suite is the field length validation. And then in particular, we're going to be testing the name field. And then we can put our test in there. And this allows us to separate the length field from the name field, but still have the overarching field length validation that we're complying to. So let's think what our first test should be. So let's just get rid of this assertion for now. And the first thing that should happen is we should say a name should fail length validation if it is not set. Okay. So what we would expect here to happen is we would expect that when we call the name length, when we validate the name length, we would expect that to, we'll do it after here, we'd expect that to equal false, because the name's just an empty string. The validation function is checking that it's at least 2 characters. So we would expect that to come back as false. And let's just run that. And now we can see that we've got 2 test suites running. You know, we've got the email one and the length one running. And then we can see that the different types of tests that are running here. The email validation, all these sorts of things. I think that's from before. So, oh, it's actually failing a test, is it? Shared utility test. Huh, that's kind of deceiving. I don't know what's going on there actually, but just ignore that. So let's just continue writing a couple of tests. So I'm just going to copy this down one. And I'll just say a name should fail length validation if it is less than 2 characters. And in this scenario, we'll just set the name equal to J. And then we'll save this. And then we got our 7 passing. And let's just check that it's actually working. So we'll set that to true. And then we get our failed test there. And then we can see it failing. And we can see where it failed. Let's just change that back to false. And let's just copy this down. And what other things would we want to test for? We want to test for if it is equal, if it is, a name should pass length validation if it is 2 characters. Let's change that to JO. Change this to true, save that. So as you can see, there's quite a, in this scenario, we're testing quite trivial things here just to illustrate the point. But we'll go ahead and we'll test something a little more sophisticated just after we write our next one of these, which I'll be able to just copy down in about a few minutes of time. So let's just see what else we have. So we tested if it's 2 characters. What if it is more than 2 characters? So we've hit all of the scenarios there. If it's not set, if it's less than the minimum value, if it is the passing value, or the 2 characters, and if it's more. So we just nailed all of those tests there. So what I want to do is I want to have another test suite. I'm just going to copy all of this because it's going to be quite similar. And this is going to be for the password field. So let's just type in password here. And we'll just change this Actually, what is this? Validate password length. I'm just going to do this here. And then all of these instances here that have name. I'm just going to change that to password. So we've got this new test suite that we're running, the password field, or password field validation. We're initially setting the password to an empty string. I must have missed one here. Password. So a password should fail length validation if it's not set. That's true or false. A password should fail length validation if it is less than 2 characters. Okay, that's good. I suppose what we would have here is a password should pass length validation if it is more than 2 characters. So actually, rather than get rid of that one, I'm going to say a password should pass length validation if it is 6 to 20 characters. And then I'll just change this to password. And a password should fail length validation if it is more than 20 characters. So I'm just going to put a whole bunch of characters here. All right, so let's save that. All right, so we got one failing, so that's not too bad, considering copied and pasted. And the one that's failing is a password should pass length validation. Oh, this should be a false. Let's save that. And now all of our test suites are passing. So we basically just check the length of them, match our validation length. And then for email, we just check that the thing included an email. So that was a nice warm up for testing, but we've actually just sort of done the JavaScript testing itself. We haven't actually tested our React component. So, I mean, that's all well and good, and we probably would want to be doing unit tests for things like that. Anyway, but we also want to, test our React component. So what we'll do is we'll test this, where is it? The sign in component here. And to do that, I'm just going to make some modifications to the actual sign in form. So let me just find where that is. So we have this sign in form here. So I'm just going to close these tests here, those unit tests there. And I'm actually going to close these as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to this button here. And I think what we're going to do is, actually I need to go to the other button, the sign in button, which is this sign in button. And I want to disable it because right now you can click it without these being set, but I want to make it so it's disabled. And if there's an error or if it's not set, and then they'll be disabled, and then we can actually test for something like that. So we're not only testing the JavaScript functions or TypeScript functions, we're actually testing the UI in isolation here. So now this is a little tricky to get started. And the reason is because we've got the Redux store set up. So what we need to do is we need to actually, provide the store state to our component. Otherwise, we'll get some sort of errors. So before I do that, though, I'm just going to add that you know, the disabled stuff here. So I'm going to make this disabled if any of these, basically if the password length of the password doesn't pass validation, or the email doesn't pass the validation, then it'll be disabled. So let's actually test this out. I'll just refresh the page here. Now, right now, I can't actually click this, and you can see that there's no cursor here. If I type in S and something like 1 here, they're both erroring. But if I just type in a valid password and also a valid email here, you can see that now I can actually click this here. So I'm getting this unauthorized error here, but that's because this doesn't exist. But I could actually click the button. So I actually want to test for that, actually test the UI side of things. But if you take a look at this sign in form component, well, actually, if you take a look at the app.tsx file, there's a couple of things going on here. And even further back to the index, you can see that we've got this provider store. And inside the component, we're using all sorts of things in here, like all of the code that we've got referenced here. But we're also referring to an auth slice, which corresponds to the store. And if we don't have access to that data, like if we just import this component and try and test it, it won't work. And there's also these routes as well around things. And what the routes do, that makes it possible to use things like a use navigate hook and stuff like that. So with that said, before we can actually test the component, we have to set up the infrastructure to set it, do the testing. And that's going to be true for any Redux-based application. So what I'll do is in shared utils, I'm just going to have a file here, and I'm just going to call it testutils.js. And I'm doing JavaScript here, so I'm just going to cancel out of this because it just makes it so that when we're dealing with the React DOM, by default, I don't think the TypeScript stuff's set up out of the box. So you have to go into the configuration and play around with that. So if you do want TS, you probably have to Google for TypeScript testing configuration. It's not really that difficult, but it's not really worth it in this scenario. Because when we're testing things like, interacting with the DOM and stuff like that, you don't really need TypeScript. So that's optional. I'll leave that up to the viewer, an exercise for the viewer if they want to explore. But basically, it's going into your configuration files and just allowing for some TSX extensions and stuff like that. Similar to if you're using something like, I don't know, Prettier or something like that, or ESLint, and then you have TSX files, and I'm just trying to look for those. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to basically, usually if you don't have this store, you can just go ahead and you can import, this render method here, and you can import that from at testing library -react. And what the render method's doing is basically what we're going to be doing here is we're going to import the actual, well, we're not going to do it here, but in our test file, we're going to import our component here. So we want this component here that we're testing for. But we need to render that component. But we can't render the component because of the nesting in the parent components. So what I'm going to do here is, and this is sort of coming from the documentation, the Redux documentation for testing, but I'm just going to call this something else, like RTL render, just to separate it from the name render. And I'm also going to go ahead and I'm going to import the configure store from the Redux Toolkit, because we're going to need to actually create our own store to provide data to the component that we want to test for. And then I'm also going to import a provider from React Redux. And then what we need to do is we need to look at the particular reducer that we want here. So we're testing the sign-in form, and it's going to have state associated with this reducer here. So we need to actually import that. So let's go ahead and import. And if you had more, you could import the all of your reducers. I'm just going to put it here for now. And then if we need to, we'll refactor it or combine the reducers. So this is coming from the features / auth slice here, .ts. So basically, you probably wouldn't want to, because this is in the shared area, you wouldn't want to necessarily just have the auth reducer. It's just we only have an auth reducer at the moment. So if we had more, it would be the shared reducers. But basically what we're doing here, how this is going to work is we're going to have a function here, and it's going to be called reducer, and it's going to do something. And then what we're going to do is we're going to export everything from the testing library React. So that means when we're in our test file, we'll be able to use all of the methods from there without importing it directly, but we'll import this file. But how we're going to override the default reducer that comes from the testing library there is we're actually going to say export reducer. So what's happening here is this is equivalent to this here, where it's taking this reducer and then it's assigning it to the reducer that's coming from here. So we're actually overriding that. And we're overriding that because we need to provide the store. So we need a wrapper around that method. So let's go ahead and do that. So this reducer, it takes the UI as the first argument, and the second's a object, and it's going to have the preloaded state, and then it's going to have the store, and we're going to need to configure the store for that. And then we can go ahead and we can say, okay, well, we've got this reducer here. We're going to have an auth reducer, which is just going to be the auth reducer that we've imported here. And then finally, we have this preloaded state here. And as a third argument, what we'll have is we'll have the render options. Now, we don't have to actually know what all these things are. These are just sort of built into the reducer, so they'll just more or less just work here. The main thing that we need to be doing, though, is actually returning the wrapper. So let's have a function here, and we'll call it wrapper, which will go ahead and it will take whatever we pass in, so the children here, and then we'll go ahead and we'll return, and then we'll have the provider here, and the provider, it's going to have the store, and we can pass in the store. And another thing we probably want here is the router. And then we can go ahead and we can put the children in there. So why do we want the router? We want the router to be able to use the hooks, use navigate and stuff like that. Otherwise we wouldn't be able to do that. So that's the wrapper there. So just below here, we can say we can just return the RTL render, which is just the regular render from the library. And we can go ahead and we can pass in the UI, which we got as an argument. And then we can have the wrapper here, which is the wrapper component that we just created. And then we can just take all of the render options that were passed in and use those. So I think this is going to make a lot more sense when we actually get into the test, which we'll do right now. So let's go to our component, and we'll create something called signinform.component.test.js. And this is where we can actually go ahead and use that. And this is going to be quite easy now that we've set this up. And the idea of this is, you know, whenever we're testing any of our components that make use of the store, which is basically every single component, or something that also makes use of the router, which is basically every single component, we have this wrapper, and we're overriding the default reducer method that allows us to output our component and able to test it. So there's more work in actually setting up the ability to do the test than actually writing the test. But what we'll do here is we'll go ahead and we'll import reducer. And this is coming from the utils here. So we can go back 3 levels, go into shared, and go into utils, and then go into test utils. And this is where we can actually import our component. So we want to get the signinform component from the signinform.component. And then this is where we can actually write our test suite. So let's just copy one from here. Just copy this part here and close it up. And close it up. Okay, so now I'm just going to comment this out just for a second here and get rid of this. What I'm going to call this test suite is, you could just call it whatever the file name is. I'm just going to call it the signinform rather than signinform component. So basically we want to be able to find a button, and there's many ways to find things. You can find it by the name, you can find it by, you know, the text here, you can find it by the type. You know, you just sort of got to play with the documentation to have a look in to how to retrieve things. But I'm going to have 2 different tests. I'm going to test that it's, you know, it's in the document, and then I'm also going to test that it's initially disabled. And of course you could test more things, and it probably would make sense to test more things like, you know, you type in the input and all of these sorts of things. But I really wanted to keep this quite simple and just give you the building blocks so you can do any of the tests that you feel like doing. So why I mentioned that we're doing 2 tests here is I'm actually going to, because we haven't seen this yet, I'm going to have a before each. And before each, it runs before each test. There's also after each and after all and before all. The difference is before all basically fires once, I'm pretty sure, whereas before each happens each time, and same with after. So you can, do things before each of the tests, or you can clean things up after each of the tests if you need to do that. But the way this works is you have this sort of callback function here. We have this arrow function here. And basically what I want to do is I want to use that reducer method that we made. And that takes the particular element that we want to create here. So we got this sign in component here. And we want to render that out. So what I want to do is I want to actually have a variable here called let sign in button. And right now I'm going to set this to null. But in our before each here, I'm going to have a sign in button. And I'm wanting to actually need to get something else in here. So we're accessing something that's on the UI or on the screen. So the way we can do that is we can say screen. Now you can do all sorts of things here, like get by ID, get by text, get by test ID, get by role, get by label text. You really got to just find the right thing that works for you, for your situation. So in this scenario here, let's take a look at what we're actually getting. So we're getting this button here, and this is a material button as well. So it's not a regular button, but we've got this screen method here, and it's smart enough to detect that the role of that is a button. So we can actually just say get by role here. And this is the type. So this is a button role. And then what we can do here is we can have, say, for example, like a regular expression. So we can have a name here, because you can have multiple buttons in here, and we do have multiple buttons. So how are we going to test for this? How are we going to get this particular button? So we can get it based off, this value here on sign in. So this is sign dash in. So if I just go ahead and say sign dash in, and this is a regular expression, and to make it case insensitive, I can just go ahead and tack this I on here at the end there. So for the button with that value for the sign in there, you can do that. And having regular expressions is often beneficial, but you gotta be careful not to get carried away spending like 30 minutes, an hour writing the regular expression, because what you're doing is you're just really testing something here. You don't have to write like super clean code here. The idea is to, it's okay to duplicate the code and all those sorts of things, because you are just testing and you're going to change them a lot, potentially, and things are going to break, and you're going to, as you change your code, you have to come back and change your tests and stuff like that. Yes, you can make it super reusable and use regular expressions and all those sorts of things, but you only got so much time. You focus more on building the features. Okay, if you have something that really needs heavy testing, then fine. But for stuff like this, don't get too carried away, that's all. Unless you want to, it's really up to you. But this before each is going to happen before each. I put this sign in button variable outside the before each so I can access it in the other test methods. So let me just cut this and put this in here. Oh, what happened there? I'll cut that and put that in here. I'll just put a space here. So I'll just uncomment this. And I'm going to recap what happened with the test utils after we've done this test. I think it makes a lot more sense that way on. Of course, we wouldn't be able to do this without that. So basically, we want to test that the login button should be in the document. And that's another tip. When you're doing testing, especially if you're doing testing something related to the UI, you always want to do something like a really, really basic test. So we just want to check that we can actually access the button and it's in the document. You want to do that before you start doing all sorts of crazy things. If you are doing all sorts of crazy things, because you just want to check that the base case, the simplest case, is working. But essentially, what we want to do is we want to get this sign in button, And we've only seen two equal now. I probably should have mixed it up a little bit, but I think it's pretty easy to tell like how to choose things like to be truthy, for example, or to be falsy, less than, equal than, all those sorts of things. You'll just find it as you need it, sort of thing. But basically, they got one here to be in the document. So let's just go ahead and run that. Let's run our npm test here. And if it's in the document, that means all the okay, so we've got something failing here. It says your test suite must contain at least one test. Okay, that's a little confusing. It is referring to this file. I don't know if I've got an extra file that's a test file somewhere else. You'd probably want to delete those. Let's see. Your test suite must contain at least one test. I'm just going to run that again. Let me just clear. See if I can get a bit of error. That's kind of confusing, to be honest. Just buttons, role. Oh, does this sign in screen button? Okay, so what I've done here is I've wanted to put this test outside of the for each. So let's run that. All right, so it's still failing here. Cannot destructure property. Okay. So I think I'm going to need to set this equal to an empty object. All right, so we got a nice error to say that the router's not defined, and that's good because we didn't actually bring that in. So let's go ahead and bring that in. See if that helps us. So let's get that. We don't need these other things here. Let's go ahead and save that. Yes, now we've got 3 passing tests here. Okay, so that's good. So that means things are working. So let me just do one more thing, and then I'm going to go back and explain what we've done today. So let me just have one more test here. And I'm going to say the login button should initially be disabled. And this should be to be disabled. Okay, so that's all working. Now, obviously, you'd probably want to do a couple of more things here. It's like you'd want to enter in your email. So to do that, for example, you would do something like this again, where you use the screen and then you can search by something, maybe by ID or by role or something, by input or something like that. And then you can specify as a second option the particular input, so the email input and then the password input. We've already tested that the pass validation stuff works, and in their own unit test there. So basically, we'd probably want to just set a couple of variables, and then click the button. But the reason I'm not doing this is because in the next video, I want to focus on integration end-to-end tests. So basically, there is a set difference between integration and end-to-end tests, where integration tests usually focuses on a end-to-end of a particular feature, but we've only got the one feature, which is the auth feature at the moment. So technically, it sort of is the end-to-end test. The terms are sort of used interchangeably, although end-to-end strictly means end-to-end of the entire application, so sign in, then the product section and everything. Those tests are sort of not really feasible to write and prone to breaking and spend a lot of time to make. And I don't know, in the industry, they usually don't get actually done. What's more common is to do an integration test, which is, so the unit test is, the isolation. So we've seen like just testing the email field, for example, or just testing that this button works. But the integration is the, entire feature. So for example, maybe you register, you get something back, and then you sign in, and then you click the button, and then, that entire experience where you actually, you can get data back from the server potentially. You don't have to, you can mock the data. There's two ways to go about that. I'm going to go into more detail about that in the next video, but that's what we'll focus on the next video is integration end-to-end tests. And I think we'll probably use something like Cypress for that. So it makes it really easy and actually like pre-fills out the form values for us and stuff like that and clicks the buttons for us. So it's kind of cool to see. I think I might have done it in the LinkedIn clone video, but I did that in Angular. So I'm doing this in React this time. I'm not going to cover the backend testing. I've done that in the LinkedIn clone series. So if you want to see more detail on, that, I've done all of the types of testing there in quite detail as well. So check that out. But just to recap what we did today before moving on, basically what we've done here, I'll just close a few things here. We started off by doing some super simple tests. So these were nothing to do with React. This was just JavaScript stuff. So we had a few TypeScript files and we had a couple of functions that we wanted to test. So we learned that we could have test suites and we can define the thing we're testing, and then we can have an assertion and actually do the test. And then we want to make sure that our function works as expected. And this also helps us test for edge cases. And it also introduces the idea of test-driven development, where it's you actually write the test first, they're going to fail, and then you want to make them pass. And coding like that makes you think of how the functions are going to be consumed before you actually write them. So it can be a bit of a mental paradigm shift, but it does help you write cleaner code, because if it passes all the tests, it just means it's more likely that you're going to have less side effects and more expected behavior, and the function is going to be easily consumed somewhere else. So we saw that. We also saw that we had the ability to have nested suites, so describes inside describes. And then we just did some simple assertions here to equal, but we saw that there was all sorts of different things you could have there. So this was all about unit tests and using React testing library to do that. Then we realized that, okay, we want to test a component. And because we using Redux and we got a store and a wrapper around our application, and our component depends on that data, and also depends on routes to use things like navigation inside that. We went ahead and we made our own custom reducer method here. So let me just get rid of this for a sec. So basically we got some stuff from testing library. And if we had a more simple application, we could have just done that directly in the test itself, import that, and then just use the reducer. But again, we needed that data from the store. So we made this wrapper function here. We imported, the provider and stuff like that, and also the router. And then we just had this wrapper component and we put the children in that. So that means, when we import the reducer method, which overrides the React testing library reducer, it does those extra things for us. And then all of this sort of stuff here, we don't really have to concern ourselves with this, but that's sort of stuff that's built into the reducer method in the original reducer method. So we just need to, have that there and fill it out sort of thing. But you can see we're doing things. We're creating the store based on our reducer or reducers that we have, for the UI that we get, and the particular options that we get and the state of our application. We can go ahead and we can, that RTL render, that's the one that's coming directly from the store. We just renamed it to that. But then that actually uses, the UI, and then we have our wrapper here, which also has our render options here, which is all, passed in for us. And then we're exporting everything, and then we're importing that. And another thing that's coming from this library here is the screen that allows us to interact with the UI. So yeah, we started by before each, so we learned about that. So before each test, we can reinitialize the sign-in form component. And that will reinitialize the state, I'm pretty sure, as well. So if you need to test, different things for situations, you can do that. You can also not do that if you don't want to. You want to do things that build off one another. You can also clear things after all the tests. But essentially, there's different ways you can access each of your DOM elements. So depending on what the DOM element is, we'll have a different method here. But basically, you use our custom reducer method, which overrides the reducer to render the component. We did that to get all the information from the store. Then we can interact with that component by using the screen, and then getting, by ID, by role, whatever it is we need to do. Maybe chuck in a little regular expression if you need be. And then we just did the test as normal. We had more UI related methods here, like is it in the document, is it disabled, and you can imagine there's all sorts of other methods there that you could use there. But yeah, this is really just like the starting point for testing. Unit testing with React testing library for both functions and components, and with React Toolkit store nesting those components. So hopefully that was helpful. As I mentioned before, in the next video, we'll get into the integration end-to-end testing. I think that's a little funner because you can see things getting clicked around for you and stuff like that, and forms filled out for you. And I think it saves a lot of time if you're doing manual testing, like typing in forms heaps and clicking around on buttons, and saves the wrist. And it's kind of cool to see as well. So I think in the previous video, I might have mentioned that we'll end up doing the store, as in the Stripe payment gateway. Well, I think I'll just do one more, finish up the testing on the front end, and then we'll start to build the, the product UI and the cart, and then we'll hook that up with the Stripe API to make our payment gateway. I'm entertaining the idea of doing something like using storybooks or something like that. But I don't know. Let me know what you guys want to see, if there's anything more in particular. They're the main topics I wanted to cover. Yeah, so thanks so much for watching. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.